Hello everybody, my name is Dratnos, and in this video I'm going to make some predictions about the patch 8.3 Mythic Plus metagame, using my tier list as a kind of resource and as a way to visualize the things that I'm thinking. So for reference, this was my tier list from patch 8.2.5, with, if you want to see the videos of me making this tier list and a recent video of me analyzing how good I think it was, and some of the statistics around it, you can check that out on my channel as well. But let's use this as a starting point, and I'm going to move specs around in this episode based on my predictions on what'll be good next patch. And then a couple weeks into the patch, or a couple months, depending on when I'm free, I will make some more videos where I actually analyze how good my predictions were and what I actually think is going on with the meta. So again, early predictions, I may be wrong on some of these things. Let's start off with DPS. So as the S tier DPS last patch, I had only Outlaw up there. I think that Outlaw will continue to be S tier. In last patch, Outlaw was represented in Rogue in general. Some of them were Assassination Rogues, but Rogues were 100% of the plus 25 keys run last season. I think that that's probably not going to be true this season. I think this coming season, Rogues are going to be in something like 95% of the top keys, not necessarily 100. I think that the Awakened Affix is going to be a lot less punishing for groups that don't have a Rogue than previous affixes have been, because it gives you access to skips with each of the obelisks. So for those of you who don't know how Awakened is going to work, there are going to be 4 obelisks throughout the dungeon, and you'll basically be able to do a skip with each of them, a shroud skip, as you do the mechanic of each obelisk. I think that Rogues are going to continue to be fantastic. I think that almost all the top groups are still going to have Rogues. I'm going to keep Outlaw in the S tier, but I believe that it's going to be more of a 95% or 90% of groups type thing, rather than a 100% of groups thing. Now, in the S tier, I am going to promote Havoc Demon Hunter. This is more of a promotion based on just what I thought. Like, I think that Havoc Demon Hunter should have been just S tier last patch, probably too, in 8.2.5. I think it is going to continue to also be about a 95% spec. It just brings so much damage, utility, the Chaos Brand amping up the rest of the group's magic damage. The combination of a Rogue and a Demon Hunter really lets you control almost everything that happens in a pack. And there's really a lot of synergy there. And a lot of coverage of basically every effect you want. And Rogue and Demon Hunter are the 2 classes that have the out-of-combat crowd control, so Sap and Imprison are crowd control abilities you can use and then walk past the mob without getting in combat, and that's really powerful. So I'm promoting Havoc Demon Hunter, less because I think it's going to be good, particularly next patch, and more because I just think it should have been there already. In the A tier, I'm going to keep Fire Mage. I think Fire Mage is going to continue to be a premier range choice, but I am going to promote up Balance Druid as well. I think Balance Druid is also going to work out really nicely next patch. One worry that I have for Balance Druid that may hold it back is that I think pull sizing is maybe going to be getting a little bigger. And Balance is not happy if you're going from like 4 targets on average to like 7 targets. That starts to be a less positive place for Balance to be. They really prefer, cleave or single target to big AoE. So that is something that I am a little bit worried about for them. But I think that all the combination of trees and all the druid utility that they bring, I think is actually going to be even more in demand for reasons that we'll get to when we get to the healer section. I'm also going to leave Assassination Rogue up in the A tier. I think that Assassination Rogue is still not going to be all that popular because Outlaw, I think, is just going to be a little bit better. But Assassination Rogue, I think, is fantastic, and there will be some that succeed with it. And who knows, it may actually even end up being a competitive or even better Rogue spec. There's always a chance that, tuning and scaling will cause those things to change. It's also worth noting that Assassination's Vendetta is going to be potentially really good against the mini-bosses that come with each of the obelisks in Awakened. Okay, so down in the B tier, I'm going to demote a couple specs out of the B tier down to the C tier. Shadow Priest is a spec that I actually liked quite a lot this patch. But I think that this series of nerfs that it's receiving are going to hurt it in Mythic Plus in particular. Chorus of Insanity nerfs and just all around. The spec is taking quite a lot of hits that are aimed at it in Raid. And I think that in Raid, those are going to do a good job of keeping it from being too OP. But I think in Mythic Plus, the effect is going to be mostly that it gets outshone by most of the other specs. So we'll drop that one down to the C tier. I'm going to leave Elemental in the B tier. Elemental is just such a weird spec where there are only a couple people playing it, but one person in particular is just dominating with it, so maybe it should even be in the A tier, but it's just so unpopular still to this day, so I don't really understand there. Unholy, I'm also going to leave in the B tier with possible potential of being better than that. I think that next patch, with Beguiling being gone, it's going to maybe be possible for us to be pulling 10 mobs, 12 mobs all the time throughout a dungeon. Unholy starts being really happy as the pull sizing inches up past, 10. And they're just doing massive damage in big AoE. So if that is what the situation looks like, Unholy might be as good as A or even S. Retribution Paladin, I'm also going to demote to C tier. Mostly, this one again is less because I think it's going to be bad next patch, and more just because I think C was probably actually the right place for it to have been all along. I could actually see the cadence of wings as a powerful cooldown being better next patch than it was this patch. But my guess is that it will probably stay about the same, which I think was more of a C tier spec than a B tier spec as I initially placed it. Fury Warrior and Windwalker are both specs that I'm split on. I'm pulled in different directions on. Fury Warrior is a spec that scales well and has been doing awesomely recently, but it's a spec that is really not happy if you are pulling 10 mobs at a time, because Fury Warrior can only cleave onto 5 targets. So next patch, with emissaries gone, if we're able to double pull more often, Fury is going to be really sad about that, and that might even lead to it being below the B tier. But if that's not what's important next patch, their single target's phenomenal, their cleave is phenomenal, and if they are just killing these lieutenant mobs that are associated with each obelisk effectively, and they're just scaling up their damage better than every other spec, then I could see them even going in the other direction. So for now, I'm going to leave them in B tier, but I could see them being an A or a C. Windwalker, I think, is going to benefit from potentially being a really good way to get access to monk utility, for reasons we'll talk about when we get to the tank section. So that'll be good news for it, but I don't know. The other melee DPS options, specs like Outlaw and Havoc, and then bringing something like a ranged in that third slot, seems like a really powerful thing to do. So Windwalker, I worry, will also just be kind of pushed out of the metagame due to not keeping up with those specs. Okay, down in the C tier, I'm mostly happy with the specs that I've left here. I am going to promote the Beast Mastery Hunter up to B tier. I think that that's probably a more appropriate place for this spec. It does a lot of useful things and reasonably good damage, and probably should have been here the whole time. The remaining specs in the C tier, I wouldn't be surprised if one of these damage specs in the C tier ends up being really good next patch. I'm just not sure which one. Frost Death Knights looked really impressive to me, actually, in some of the runs that I've seen. Nagi from Mythic playing it in some keys, it's looked really good. But on the other hand, that guy makes Frost Death Knight look good always, so it could just be him and not the spec. I'm not sure. So Frost is something that I'm really keeping my eye on. Outside of that, Enhancement, there's been one person owning with that spec also on the leaderboard, so maybe that's a sleeper high damage spec. But really, many of these specs' fundamental problems haven't changed. Frost Mage actually is another one that may end up creeping up as a new popular mage spec in keys next season. They scale really well. All the mage specs, but Frost in particular also scales really well with the crit corruption that's going to be on our gear. And there's just lots of good things coming for the spec. Looks like it's going to be in a good spot next patch, so I can see Frost even overtaking Fire as the popular mage spec, especially if we want to be like kiting packs and doing big pulls, where Frost's crowd control kit and all of the slows end up also being really big. And the Frozen Orb build also scales really nicely into big pulls, so I could see Frost being better than here. That might be the most likely spec. Frost Death Knight or Frost Mage being better than the C tier where I have them right now. Finally, in the D tier for DPS, I think that most of these specs are going to continue to be here. I could see a spec like Demonology maybe actually being deserving in the C tier, a spec that may scale up and be doing even more damage next patch. But for now, I'm going to leave the DPS specs in the D and F tiers where they are. Okay, let's move on to healers. This is a really interesting discussion where many smart people have disagreements about which healer specs are going to be gaining and losing next patch. Well, there's a lot of agreement about which specs are moving in which direction, but a lot of disagreement about how far those specs are moving and whether it's causing any overtakes to happen. I believe that all three specs of Resto Druid, Holy Paladin, and Mistweaver are going to be fantastic next patch. I think that Resto Druid is receiving a small set of nerfs, and it's receiving a big situational nerf or circumstantial nerf in that Beguiling is going away. Beguiling was a Resto Druid affix. Beguiling was this affix where spamming Entangling Roots on a Tide's Emissary, Typhooning, Ursul's Vortexing, Moonfiring an Enchanted Emissary. These were all absurdly strong things that Resto Druids could do. And with that effect going away, that I think is going to drop Resto Druid for the first time in a very long time out of the S tier and into an A tier, where I think it will be competitive with other healer specs. Mistweaver is receiving a bunch of buffs to their throughput that I think are going to be great for them. So I think that Mistweaver is also going to be an A tier spec. I think that their previous problems of mana conservation issues are going out the window with these extra buffs and with the extra set of gear that we're all receiving. So I think that they're going to be able to sustain the required throughput for a high key without actually running into trouble anymore. So I think Mistweaver is also going to be an A tier spec. Also, I think a great way to get access to the monk utility that I think we might not be getting from the other roles in the group next patch. So getting things like Ring of Peace and Mystic Touch from your Mistweaver, I think is going to be a fantastic place to get them. And the Way of the Crane playstyle is going to work really nicely if we're able to pull big more often. Mistweavers are going to be doing massive DPS and HPS if they're using that Way of the Crane to facilitate, pulling 20 mobs like we see in MDI pulls all the time. Finally, Holy Paladin, I also think is now going to be an A-tier spec. Holy Paladin was already a spec that did well this season, even though Beguiling was much worse for them than it was for Resto Druid. I think that in high keys in particular, their damage output is absurd. It's so good compared to every other healer spec, basically. They just do massive AoE and massive single target damage, and they can use their offensive cooldowns for more, or they can use their defensive cooldowns for more offense if they want to, and they passively do damage even while healing with the Glimmer of Light playstyle. There are some nerfs coming to Glimmer of Light, a healing reduction on it, and a target cap. Target cap isn't a huge deal, it just means they'll have to be a little bit more careful with how many offensive glimmers they put out. It should still be totally fine for them in Mythic Plus, and more impactful change for Raid, I'd say. And the healing reduction, I think, is going to be outclassed by the fact that Holy Paladin just scales better than any other healer. 30 item levels worth of gear on a Holy Paladin is just going to be more valuable than it is on any other healer, because point for point, they get so much value from each point of crit and haste, that's just going to be, it's going to be absurd for them. And I think that they are going to be doing really well. Not to mention Vision of Perfection is getting buffed, an essence that only Holy Paladin really uses right now. It's getting a 12% proc rate buff. Holy Paladin already had to have a nerfed version of Vision of Perfection for their spec. Their Vision of Perfection just applied less than any other specs because it was already so good for them. But that getting buffed by 12% is bigger for them than it is for anybody else, I'd say. So all three of these healer specs I think are going to be fantastic. And I think that largely you're going to make decisions about the rest of your comp based on which of these three healer specs you're going to want to bring. If you want to play a Mistweaver, then you don't need to bring a Monk in one of the other spots. Whereas if you're playing a Resto Druid or a Holy Paladin, yeah, maybe you want a Windwalker or a Brewmaster. And if you're playing something like, you might play something like Holy Paladin, Prot Warrior, Windwalker Outlaw Havoc or something, or Windwalker Outlaw Fury or something cool like that. Whereas if you're playing Mistweaver, maybe you're getting in there with like Unholy Havoc Outlaw, something cool like that. And still probably a Prot Warrior in that comp. Anyways, I'm getting away from myself a little bit, but I think that largely you're going to see big differences in comps that are revolving around which of these three healer specs are brought. I expect to see all three of these healer specs time the highest level of keys next season. Down in the lower tiers, I still worry about all the other healer specs. There are some good news items coming in the next patch. There's a new minor essence on Spirit of Preservation that's going to allow specs like Disc Priest and Resto Shaman to shore up a little bit of their tank healing weakness by empowering, Shadow Mend or Healing Surge. And that might be enough to bring them up into the C tier, being able to keep a tank alive a little bit more effectively. But I think that the gap between the three top healer specs and the three other specs is still going to be wide, and I still want to leave it at 2 tiers. So I'm going to leave the other healer specs down in the D and F tiers. And finally, in the tanking department. Next patch, Beguiling is going away, which is fantastic news for Protection Warriors. Protection Warriors got clapped by Emissaries of the Tides, and with those going away, it's just going to be a great time to be a Prot Warrior. You're going to be able to spell reflect some of the casts from the Lieutenants under the Obelisk, so that's going to be even more value from there. And their damage output, I think, is just going to be way higher than everybody else, and they just tank physical damage so well. Most of Mythic Plus is physical damage, and even more of the damage in Mythic Plus next season will be physical than this season. So for those reasons, I am promoting Protection Warrior to an S tier spec. I think that it's going to be by far the most popular tank in high keys. All of the other tank specs I think will be good and will be playable, and especially once you start being a level or two below the very top, I think that all of them will work fine. It's not going to be like, maybe the healer meta where you'll really notice having one of the weaker healer specs. I think that any of the tank specs is going to work out if the person knows what they're doing. Brewmaster is a spec that's getting a lot of nerfs. It's a spec right now in patch 8.2.5 that can do a tremendous amount of self-healing and takes a very small amount of damage, and both of those things are getting nerfed dramatically next patch. For that reason, I'm going to drop Brewmaster down to the B tier, but I could see it even falling lower. I could see it being really a C tier spec. The nerfs are substantial in Mythic Plus. They're really bad. So I think that it's going to be bad times for Brewmaster, and that's part of the reason that I think specs like Mistweaver are going to be rising in value, is because I think you're going to not want your tank to be the Monk anymore. You're going to want to bring the Monk in a different spot in the group. Protection Paladin, Vengeance Demon Hunter, I still expect to be B tier specs. I expect them to work out fairly well. and be able to do the job, even be timing fairly high keys. But I think that there'll still be a full tier between them and the Prot Warriors. I think the Prot Warrior is going to be by far the dominant tank in the high keys. Blood Death Knight is a spec that there's a lot of hype around. People come into my stream all the time and ask me, if I'm excited for Blood Death Knight and Mythic Plus next season. I think that the hype is mostly around Raid. I think that in Raid, Blood Death Knight is going to be quite good because it's going to be able to handle heavy magic damage consistently, pretty reliably, and require low amounts of healing. That's not the Mythic Plus damage profile at all. Mythic Plus is huge spikes of incoming physical damage, and Blood Death Knight is not good against that. That is still bad times to be a Blood Death Knight. They had this weapon on PTR as well that was doing huge damage for them. That got nerfed. It's still going to be big damage, but it's not going to be enough to justify bringing a Blood Death Knight to a really high key, I think. I think that their squishiness is still going to be a big problem. So I'm going to leave them in the C tier. And also in the C tier, I'm going to leave Guardian Druid. Guardian Druid, again, none of these tank specs I think is that bad. I think that you'll be able to do keys with any of these tank specs in the same way that you could, play with a Frost Mage or whatever, and it would be fine too. I don't think that, I think that there's kind of the big line between where you'll start to feel the specs weaknesses in anywhere except a really, really high key. I think the big line for that is between C and D. I think that everything that's C and above works fairly well up to most levels of key. And I think really the only time where you start to care about the line being, at the A level is for the 25s this season and whatever the equivalent number is next season. So I think Guardian will continue to be fine in the medium to high key range, but I think in the highest key range, their heavy damage intake, especially on pull, is going to start to really get them into trouble. And they have some trouble with affixes like Necrotic. Just Necrotic is an affix that Guardian handles fairly poorly because they take such a heavy amount of incoming damage at the start of the pull that they're playing from behind the whole time. And then by the time they are able to be tanky and receive a bunch of healing, they're already low on health with a bunch of Necrotic stacks. So for these reasons, I'm going to leave Guardian in C as well. But I would really like to just mention that I think that as long as you are not trying to push, within a couple levels of top keys, everything C and higher will work out. Some of the specs in C and B will require more of a comp to be built around them, but even specs in A have these restrictions. Balanced Druids and Fire Mages, for instance, have restrictions on how your group can pull and what other specs can be in your group comp. So that's not a death knell for a spec, if that's true. And I think that you should, playing with all these specs is a great way to learn about what they do and learn how they operate, and maybe you'll discover something cool that you get access to with them. So I would encourage you to do keys with all these specs and try it out, see what they do, see what you can learn from playing with them in your group. Anyways, that's been my little spiel. Here is my prediction tier list. This is the final official Dratnos prediction tier list for the Mythic Plus metagame of patch 8.3. I'm excited to see what you guys think. I could certainly be wrong about what the important things are going to be next season. I've made some educated guesses about what I think the removal of Beguiling, the addition of Awakened, and the class balance changes are going to do to the metagame, but I don't know everything. There might be effects that I'm missing. I'm not an expert on every spec. I try to know things about all the specs, but there are definitely cases where I've been wrong. I was wrong in a couple spots on my last tier list, so really excited to hear you guys in the comments. Let me know what you think. Make your own tier list, share it with me. I'd be happy to talk about it. And yeah, we'll revisit this in a couple months when we know some more about what was actually good. Thanks everybody for watching. I'll see you in the next one. Bye.